So, ladies and gentlemen, Cincinnati Mayor John Cranley, University of Cincinnati President Neville Pinto, Foundation President Peter Langren, Board of Trustee member Phil Collins, professors, department heads, Warren Bennis Leadership Institute Board, and board co-chairs Neil Novak and Dr. Joan Linhart Plunkett, Warren Bennis Leadership Experience board members and student team. Today's sponsors listed in our program and our notable out-of-town guests today: Kate Bennis, daughter of Warren Bennis, Kate's son Luke Movis, Doris Kearns Goodwin, David Gergen, distinguished guests all. Welcome to the second Warren Bennis Leadership Experience, where our focus today is on building a culture of fresh ideas. My name is Jack Fitzgerald. I am the founder and organizer of the Warren Bennis Leadership Experience. I am currently a graduate student in the Masters of Applied Psychology program at the University of Cincinnati. I had prepared some remarks for you this evening, and I will get to those later in this program, but at this point in time, I want to introduce Cincinnati Mayor John Cranley.
Thank you. What a fantastic program you have this evening. I'm glad to help kick it off and to honor Warren Bennis, in whose name we are gathered to celebrate and to have some great dialogue with some of the greatest minds in the country. I have to welcome David Gergen and Doris Kearns Goodwin to Cincinnati. I was able to talk to them briefly beforehand. David Gergen and I actually shared a stage once before. My graduation from Harvard Law School, I was the class speaker and he was our guest speaker. And what I remember about that speech of Mr. Gergen was telling us then that if you don't make time to reflect, meaning if you go into a law firm and work 80 hours a week and don't ever make time to reflect, to contemplate, and to engage in civic life, life will not have the meaning that you hope it will, with the promise of a law degree with lots of potential. And I can't think of a person who's served Democrats and Republicans better and hitting that thing that Arthur Schlesinger mentioned, the vital center, that unfortunately is moving far and far away from us, than David Gergen. And it's a great honor to be with him again and to have him here in our Queen City. And Doris Kearns Goodwin is sort of somebody I've been following. I've read all of her books, except the most recent one, which I'm going to read. But she has taught us so much. One, that as bad as things are, they've been much worse in this country, and we've come through with incredible leadership. But she also told us something about Cincinnati. The Bully Pulpit is a great book to read for many reasons, but as a Cincinnatian, to learn about our history and really how proud we should be of William Howard Taft. And another Cincinnatian she writes about, in a team of rivals, Sam and Chase stood up against the lynch mob at the beginning of his political career when he was extremely ambitious, and that was not a popular move for him to do, but he did it. And one of the things that Ms. Kearns Goodwin brings out in her books is that at all the critical times, those great leaders understood certain things like due process, the right to a fair trial, human rights, standing up for the individual who the mob is about to take over, and that the best forces have held back those kinds of prejudices of people, leaders, other leaders that are demonizing minority groups, holding them back. And it is a huge honor to meet her personally, because I love her books and will keep reading them and rereading them, and we're glad to have her here. But my job is to be brief and to shut up, but also to honor Warren Bennis. So let me just say a few things about him. Warren Bennis was the 22nd president of the University of Cincinnati. He's credited in leading the university's transformation throughout the 70s. He wrote more than 30 books. and he led a platoon during World War II at the age of 19. He was sought out by generations of leaders, among them Howard Schultz, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Gerald Ford, and Reagan. And he was an educator and taught organizational studies at Harvard, Boston, University of Southern California, and MIT. And at Warren Bennis was referred to by Forbes magazine as the Dean of Leadership Gurus in 1996. And the University of Cincinnati was the place where Warren Bennis learned to be the type of leader he famously wrote about. So I'm honored to declare today as Warren Bennis Day in the city of Cincinnati. Thank you very much.
Well, let me be the second person to wish you an official happy Warren Bennis Day in Cincinnati. At this time, I would like to introduce and welcome to the stage Warren Bennis's daughter, Kate Bennis. Let us welcome Kate.
Thank you. My father spent his life working on democracy, working for democracy. He truly believed that our American system of democracy offered the best path towards equality and justice for all. He was idealistic, he was optimistic, and he worked with discipline and a sense of play that was contagious. First, he fought for democracy as a soldier in World War II, then in a lifetime of educating leaders and future leaders. Here in Cincinnati, he worked to assure access to excellent higher education. For he believed, like Thomas Jefferson, that democracy and education depend upon one another. Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia, where knowing there could be no truly democratic system without an educated populace. And my father knew there could be no truly educated populace without a democratic system which not only valued, but gave access to higher education. As a kid, my dad never imagined he himself would go to college. He grew up poor. He knew no one with a college degree. As a teenager then, during World War II, he volunteered for the officers training program, and at age 19, as we heard, he marched his troops into Germany on foot in 1945. One guy in his platoon, a much older guy, 26, spoke wistfully of his undergraduate years at a place called Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. A romantic and foreign land to this young kid from the South Bronx, Ohio. And Dad learned a lot about it. He learned that they had a co-op program, which meant that he could work while he was in school to pay his rent and utilities and gain experience and receive college credits. And the GI Bill would pay for his tuition. So after the war, Dad went to Antioch and then to MIT, where he was lucky enough to be part of this nascent study of organizational behavior, or how groups function, which was, of course, a very hot topic right after World War II and the Nazis, and they were thinking, how could this have happened? Without the co-op program and the GI Bill, my father never would have become the person that he became. Education gave my father a path to everything. The flow of ideas, relationships, colleagues, economic security, work with meaning, and most importantly, a voice in the world. The flow of ideas kept him focused on moving and changing and grasping where he was going to go next with his work. He believed in public higher education. He wanted everybody to have the opportunities that he had. So when the University of Cincinnati, which was the very first university to have a co-op program, was at a crossroads not knowing whether to continue as a city-sponsored municipal university with limited room for growth and access, or join the Ohio state system, my father took the job of moving the university to the state system to make sure that many generations of Cincinnatians could afford to go to college. And of course, he did not do this alone. He recruited young people, UC students and graduates, many of them right here in this room. I almost want to see hands. Who was involved in that campaign? I know there are a lot of you here that were involved in the campaign. They were like 20 or 24 years old. He took them right out of college. Mike Ullman, Tom Humes, just in their 20s, were brought to run the campaign. In fact, this room is filled with them. Bill Mulvihill, Jay Chatterjee were professors and students, and Jack Rouse, who put on the most amazing inauguration that this velvet tuxedo-clad 7-year-old could have imagined, with the 70s anthem, The Age of Aquarius, still kind of giving me shivers. Dad had an unorthodox leadership style, opening his life, his work in our house to students and professors at all times of the day and night. He brought students in to observe budget meetings, up to Columbus to meet the governor. He worked closely with members of student government like Dick Thornburg, who's here. Over the many years, he included students like Neil Novak and Bruce Hoppel and Joan Plunkett, and they became integral parts of our lives. They drove my dad to meetings. They were our babysitters. They taught us how to play cards. They helped out during parties and parked cars and cleaned up and shushed us to bed, and it was only semi-exploitative, I promise. Our household was filled not only with generosity and serious play and playful work, but we got a lot done. And now, all grown up, these upstarts and whippersnappers, these beloved and respected friends and colleagues, have come together once more to honor my father and his work. And I am honored, I am thrilled to announce that the Warren Bennis Leadership Institute at the University of Cincinnati is expected to launch next year. And they just were meeting about it just now. I cannot imagine my father's response to this. He would be over the moon. The Institute is a bold initiative that embraces the work, life, and legacy of my father, with Joan Plunkett and Neil Novak, my babysitters, as co-chairs. And with many of those mentioned here joining us in its development, Dad would be so proud and grateful to see this happen at the University of Cincinnati, and honored to see UC become a vital center of learning for our next generation of leaders. In the last years of my dad's life, Dad and I talked a lot about what he would leave behind. He wanted to know that his work had done some good, and that his experience as a leader and thinking about leadership would shape our organizations and governments to be not only more efficient and productive, but more humane and just. Since his death in 2014, I have wondered how my father would view the world today with its starkly polarized and clashing ideologies. He had lived through a lot. He'd lived through World War II and blacklisting and the civil rights movement and the anti-war protests of the 60s. So he may have been philosophical, and with his boundless optimism, had known that our democratic system would right itself and continue forward. It's been hard for me personally to be optimistic about the future until I met Jack Fitzgerald, who, as an undergraduate here, put together the first Warren Bennis Leadership Experience. This kid, where is he? This kid, Jack, this event, this opportunity. Where is he? Jack! This opportunity, this experience, this moment to come together and listen and learn and think hard about leadership and how to give a new generation the skills to move forward in a complex and daunting time comes out of the unlikely relationship between a man who had just died and a student in the university that man had led almost 40 years before. They never met, but their relationship is undeniable. I can see my father putting his hand on your shoulder, Jack, and saying, "Not bad, my boy, not bad." Jack has one big thing in common with my father. He is optimistic without reason, beyond reason. So when we were discussing who we might entice to come here to speak with us, we were unambivalent about shooting for the moon. The most obvious choices were Dad's thought partner and dear friend, David Gergen, and presidential historian and my personal hero, Doris Kearns Goodwin. Why not ask, right? You never know. One of my dad's joys was his annual sojourn back east in the fall from USC. Dad would pack up his computers and his sweaters and his galoshes and head to Cambridge and work at Harvard. And you might think it was for the fall leaves or, Harvard, but of course the real draw was David Gergen. Dad just adored spending time with him. They thought through how to collaborate, and they were trying to make something meaningful together. They were dear friends and respected colleagues, and Dave and Dad had the same concern. How can we enlist more young leaders into work in the public sector? David told me that Dad was his mentor and role model in creating the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Through CPL, over 500 students have enjoyed full ride fellowships, along with extensive leadership preparation. A number of them are young military veterans who are running for Congress this fall. Not bad. Not bad, my boy, he'd say. David Gergen is a professor of public service and the director of the Center for Public Leadership. In addition, he serves as a senior political analyst for CNN. In the past, he served as a White House advisor to 4 U.S. presidents in both parties, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. He wrote about these experiences in his New York Times bestseller, Eyewitness to Power, The Essence of Leadership, Nixon to Clinton. Professor Gergen's work as director of the Center for Public Leadership has enabled him to work closely with a rising generation of younger leaders, especially social entrepreneurs, military veterans, and the young global leaders chosen by the World Economic Forum. He has been awarded 27 honorary degrees. Welcome, David. Doris Kearns Goodwin is a world-renowned presidential historian, public speaker, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and New York Times #1 best-selling author. She is a writer who makes history not only relevant and gripping, but vital as a way to understand our world today. Her brand new book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, takes a look at leadership styles and influences of Lincoln, both Roosevelts, and Johnson, and I cannot recommend it highly enough for leaders and citizens and anyone who loves a good story. Her first book, Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream, which drew upon her conversations with the late president, became her first New York Times bestseller. Goodwin's book, No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, the Home Front in World War II, won the Pulitzer Prize in History. A sports journalist as well, Goodwin was the first female journalist to enter the Boston Red Sox locker room in 1979. Thank you so much for joining us. We are lucky to also have 2 wonderful moderators for tonight's event. Donna Crobot Mason is an associate professor and director of the Center for Organizational Leadership at the University of Cincinnati. Her focus is on leadership across differences and strategies for creating organizational practices, policies, and a climate that support diversity and foster intergroup collaboration. She is the author of the book, Boundary Spanning Leadership, 6 Practices for Solving Problems, Driving Innovation, and Transforming Organizations. Welcome. And Gail T. Fairhurst is a distinguished university research professor of organizational communication at the University of Cincinnati. She specializes in organizational and leadership communication processes, including those involving paradox, problem-centered leadership, and framing. She is the author of 3 books, including The Power of Framing, Challenging the Language of Leadership. Welcome, professors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Welcome to Doris and David. We're so pleased that you're here to help us celebrate Warren Bennis' legacy. And so our first question to both of you is, what did Warren mean to you? What does his legacy mean to you?
Please. No, go for it.
Well, when I think about the new book that I've written, there's no question that Warren's own incredible work formed a huge part of the book. He wrote On Becoming a Leader, which I read before I wrote the first third of the book, which has my guys as young guys. I don't mean to call them guys and seem undeferential, but I've lived with them for so long that I feel like I know them. You know, my only fear in having lived with these dead presidents for so long is that someday there's going to be an afterlife of a panel of all the presidents that I've ever studied, and everyone will tell me everything I missed about them, and first person to scream out will be Lyndon Johnson. How come that damn book on the Roosevelts was twice as long as the book he wrote about me? But I started this new book on leadership with when each one of my 4 guys, Lincoln, the 2 Roosevelts, and LBJ, were young, in part because I was in a college audience, and a student raised his hand, and he said, but you're talking about these leaders in the White House. How can we ever become one of them? They're too remote. They're too far from us. And so I decided if I started when they were young, before they were clear what they were doing, when they were going to fail, when they were going to make mistakes out of cockiness, then ordinary people, young people, could aspire and struggle with them along with their own struggles. So one of the things that Warren talked about is the importance of coming through failure and trying again. Lincoln, when he was 23, ran for office, and he wasn't sure that he was going to win, and he writes this handbill to the public, and he says, I don't have any popular relations to recommend me. I'm young and unknown to many of you. I suspect that I may not win this election, and if I don't, well, if you reject me, I've been too familiar with disappointment to be very much chagrined. But then he says, and I think Warren would say, good, old boy. He said, but I'm going to try 5 or 6 times maybe, and then if I lose then, I might be too humiliated to try again. But I promise I will keep trying. So that ability to keep trying through failure, he talks about, Warren Bennis does, the ability to acknowledge mistakes and learn from them and grow more wisdom as a result. All of those traits, I think I tried to incorporate in the young guys in the first third of the book. But the main thing that I think Warren Bennis' legacy taught me was that he has the theory that really is attributed to him, that leaders grow through having gone through a crucible, and that if you can get through a really tough time and through adversity and a trial by fire, and come out not so much broken by it, not so much untouched by it, but touched by it with perspective and wisdom, then those are the people who become great leaders. And each one of my 4 guys went through such a crucible. Lincoln had a suicidal depression so deep, knives and razors and scissors were taken from his room, but he came forward with that, still hoping that someday he would be able to do something worthy that might stand the test of time. Teddy Roosevelt lost his wife and his mother on the same day in the same house, and went into a depression, but came out of that by going to the Badlands and riding his horse 15 hours a day to try and get out of the thoughts in his mind, and became a man of the West. He probably never would have become president, he said, without that. FDR, of course, had his crucible of polio, which changed him fundamentally. He emerged more warm-hearted, more accustomed to other people for whom fate had also dealt an unkind hand. It gave him that channeling of other people's thoughts and feelings that he might not have had before. Lyndon Johnson, when he was the most powerful majority leader in the Senate, had a serious heart attack, a massive heart attack, and when he came out of his depression, he asked himself the question, what if I die now? What would I be remembered for? And then he started working even then in the Senate on civil rights, and in the presidency that became his main ambition. So at some point, those harrowing experiences transformed ambition for self into ambition for something larger, which is what we're looking for leaders, and that's exactly the theme of some of Warren Bennis's great works. So I feel like I know him. Kate, that was such an emotional story that you told, and I'm so glad that David and I can be here to honor your father. He meant a lot to me. I wish I'd known him as well as David. I did have the chance to meet him a few times, but his words and his work are in my head and in my heart.
Thank you. Good evening. It is it's a special honor to appear here with Doris. She has just completed her latest book and has been on book tour and took time out to come here to honor Warren Bennis and his legacy. But I must tell you, I'm about 50 pages from the end of the book. That she's written. It's called Leadership in Turbulent Times. And I want to hawk the book right now. You should get this book. It is a wonderful read, and I think that you'll find in it many of the ideas of Warren Bennis, but also many of the observations of Doris Kearns Goodwin. She has been the nation's premier historian and storyteller about the American experience, and you're so fortunate. All of us are so fortunate that she's now been able to finish the book and come out and talk to us about what she's discovered. And I think of dear Warren Bennis. He was a glorious man, and he did have an important legacy. You know, for decades, colleges and universities have promised that they would prepare the leaders of tomorrow. That was one of their grand missions, along with research. And yet, most colleges and universities paid only lip service to that idea. Because for a long, long time, the study of leadership was not taken seriously within the academy. It was soft. You know, soft skills are hard to measure. Social science has become increasingly data-driven. And if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. You know, there is this sort of like, and they're still in this, it's almost impossible to be tenured in the field of leadership. It's almost impossible to get a PhD in the field of leadership still. But what Warren did was he legitimized the study of leadership in colleges and universities, especially at the undergraduate and the master's degree levels. And that changed everything. You know, business schools now believe they can prepare the managers and leaders of the future in the private life. Warren believed that could be done not only in private life, but in public life, and applied to the lessons of public life. And so he wrote a whole series of books. I think the best of them is this the book on becoming a leader that Doris, and by the way, this is much shorter, but but like Doris's work, it's very accessible. You know, it's a fun read. It's something that sort of brings you on because they are both extremely good storytellers. And in Warren's case, it was interesting. Kate recently got a gift for Jack. That was, she said, in this gift you'll find everything Warren Bennis thought you could find about leadership in one place. And it was the complete works of Shakespeare. Warren loved talking about Shakespeare. There would always be something that was out there. You know, like Glendower and Hotspur. Talking about one would say to the other, I can call spirits from the vasty deep. And John Kennedy wrote about this, and the answer was, well, I can too, and so can any man. But if you call them, will they come? That was the kind of question that Warren liked to present. And so it's really important how he had been enabled universities to take leadership much more seriously. And now the study of leadership and what it takes, it can't all be done in the classroom. It can't be done in books. People have to get out in the arena. They have to have a lot of trial and error on their own. But it can begin you on that journey. And leadership is a life's journey. And Warren recognized that. And he left behind a series of ideas that Doris has drawn upon and elaborated upon and sort of allowed those ideas to evolve. But they had much to do with your younger years when you were rubbing up against the world for the first time and coming into the arena in your 20s, whether it's through service or other things, but especially through service. And in Doris' case, all four of her men, as she calls them, the people in the boys' club, by the end of their 20s, had developed the characteristics of leadership. They were on their road, they were on their journey, and everybody recognized they were special. But then they tended in their 30s to run into this crucibles when you really got knocked down. All of us, if you're going to be successful in life, the people I trust in politics, frankly, are the people who have been knocked down. If you know people can take that, if they're resilient, they have self-understanding, that they've come to grips with they're not the best thing ever created in the eyes of man. They make them much better leaders. But that whole process, that going through the crucible moment, and Doris has got a chapter on each one of those, and the crucibles they had to deal with. It's one of these old stories about if it doesn't kill you, it can merely strengthen you. And Warren understood that. He had his own, crucibles along the way. And he understood, and he was humbled by them, but he was stronger as a result of them. So I find that Warren left not only a legacy of changing universities, but he left a storehouse of ideas from which we continue to draw today. And finally, I just think the legacy that I experienced and was privileged to experience was his friendship. He was a dear, dear friend. He was always there for you. He took me under his wing. He gave me, we would have long conversations and just go out, the two of us would go out to dinner. I used to visit him in California, where he was at the University of Southern California in his later years. And we regularly would meet there and just spend an evening or two together if we could, just talking and sharing tales and going all the way back to World War II. He'd been in the war. And he had such rich experiences in life, and he had what is an abiding strength of leaders. He had a wonderful sense of humor. And I'm just telling you, we don't talk about things like that enough. Doris and I were talking a little while ago about wellness and about trying to protect yourself in life and taking time out. I hope we can talk more about that. Finding your own sanctuary, really important for leadership. So there's so much I could go on and on, but I really want to, you're so lucky to have her. I really want to have Doris. I'll just sit here and watch and listen. Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
You better not just sit there and watch.
Yeah. Thank you.
So David, if I could stay with you and go from the lofty to some of the realities of today.
You don't want to do that, it'll ruin people's dinner.
Given your history of working with both Democrats and Republicans, could you comment on today's tribalism? compared to your time in the White House? And I have a second parter after that.
Well, let me just say, I'm glad in some ways that Warren is not here, because he would have to reconsider one of the major arguments he made in life. And he wrote a wonderful essay back in the late 80s, early 90s, why democracy is inevitable. And he concluded it was just, and that was sort of time that Francis Fukuyama was writing a book called The End of History. There were a lot of people who concluded as the Soviet Union crashed, as communism and the wall crashed, that we were opening a new chapter in which everybody would embrace the idea of free peoples and free markets, and the possibilities of full democracy and freedom of the press and that sort of thing. And we've entered this chapter now, not only in the United States, but across Western Europe and across much of the world, where democracy is increasingly in peril. And one country after another, there's a spate of books out now, but one I would commend to you is called How Democracies Die. And it points out that since the fall of the wall, 12 different countries, led by democratically elected leaders, have turned into authoritarian countries. And you can see that in Hungary, you can see it in Poland, and you can certainly see it in Turkey, as we're going through this whole thing with Erdogan now and the Khashoggi case and everything. One country after another, you can see the far right, the alt-right rising in Italy. Merkel is in some trouble in Germany. We've seen Brexit. We are not as far down that track as other nations right now, but I can just tell you in our politics, there are certainly a lot of worrisome signs that if we don't correct here soon, if we don't right the ship, that we could really move into directions that we will never forgive ourselves for leaving to the next generation. And we need to pay attention to this and really get serious about it on both sides. And I don't really care whether you're working for a Democratic or a Republican administration. The real issue is are you going to work for an administration that serves all the people and not some sliver or base or some element of the people, because that's what creates tribalism. And increasingly, Doris was pointing this out when we were meeting with some students earlier on. There are surveys now that show, for a long time people who are very traditional didn't necessarily have their children marry outside their religion. Today, as Doris was pointing out, more than half the people don't want their children to marry outside the party, outside the political party. I don't know what you tell independents in that situation. I'm not sure what you're going to do. But that's alarming. The leaders I worked for, and listen, they weren't always the best. I thought the World War II generation was wonderful, and I continue to look up to people from that generation. I think the baby boom population or generation has not been anywhere near as effective. But the leaders that I look up to come from both sides because they cared about, and what I found when I first went to Washington and World War II generation was there. There were people who were strong Democrats, there were people who were strong Republicans, but almost to a person, they thought of themselves as first and foremost Americans. One of the reasons for that, and I'll stop here, one of the reasons for that, I'm convinced, is that 75 to 80% of the members of Congress has served in a military uniform. Many of them in World War II. People who fought under the same flag. When you had a Saltonstall from Massachusetts saluting some Polish kid from Brooklyn, they didn't really care when they looked in the foxhole whether you're red, white, or green next to them. The question was, can you shoot? And that was a very important part of our legacy and why the World War II generation was successful. Today, it's no longer 75 or 80%. We're down to about 15%. And it makes a real difference. And that's why it's so important that we train a new generation for national service. I don't care whether you're in a military uniform or you're out in a civilian uniform. It's time to ask our kids to give back, and we will grow a new generation. Doris and I share a lot of optimism about what's coming, the people who are coming in the next generation. And we just we need to pass that baton on pretty damn fast. Okay. Thank you.
So Doris, we're interested in your reflections about the role of social media. And in particular, do you think maybe Lincoln or Reagan, given that they were so fond of storytelling, how do you think they might have reacted to social media?
I think what the leaders of the past would be worried about with social media is that it truncates ideas, that things are said that can't be taken back, that there's a viral nature to it, and what becomes viral is what is the most angry sometimes. What storytelling means, and it meant to Lincoln, meant to all of my guys actually, is you tell a story of where the country has come, where it is now, and where it is going, and that takes time to tell. And a story has a beginning and a middle and an end. I mean, Lincoln loved telling stories. Somebody said to him, "Why do you tell so many stories?" He said, "Because people remember stories. They reach their hearts as well as their minds. And they remember stories better than they will facts and figures." He never spoke extemporaneously when he was president. He knew he wanted his words to be prepared. He could debate as well as anybody could have. If you had put him into that Twitter world today, I mean, there was a moment when somebody yelled at him in a debate, "Lincoln, you're two-faced." And he reached back and he said, "If I had two faces, do you think I'd be wearing this face?" He could do that as well as anybody. But he said once he became president that his words mattered. So he made sure to prepare what it was that he was said. Or I think about FDR coming into the presidency at the same time that radio had been established. So there's a national radio, essentially. Most people are listening to the same fireside chat that he was giving 30 times during his presidency. Saul Bellow said you could walk down the street on a hot Chicago night and you could see everybody sitting in their kitchens and living rooms looking at their radio, and that his voice would come out on the street and you could hear his voice and keep walking and not miss a word of what he was saying. He understood when he was doing these fireside chats that he was talking to individuals in the country, that he was melding them together as a common whole. He was explaining why the banks had collapsed, why you needed to get your money back into the banks, why he would make it okay. And he was able to make people feel he was actually talking to them in their living rooms. There's a construction worker running home one night, and the partner said, "Where are you going?" He said, "Well, my president's coming to speak to me in my living room. It's only right that I be there to greet him when he comes." So there was a national voice at that time. People might have disagreed with it, but there was a set of facts that he was able to make people agree on rather than opinions that might be different. And he established a bond with the people that carried them through the Depression and World War II, and how different it is today. When I think about there were 3 television networks for Reagan and for JFK, but now we watch divided cable networks. We are involved with social media, reading only what we want to read. Without a shared political truth, it's hard for a democracy to go forward. There's a sense right now of alternative facts, of fabricated facts, of lies. And unless we can figure out how not only to bring people back, as I think David said, to a sense of each other as common American citizens, Teddy Roosevelt warned that the rock of democracy would founder when people who are seeing one another from different parties, races, religions, or regions of the country see each other as the other rather than themselves. And that the most important thing, he said, was for a politician, and I think our politicians have failed us in this regard, to get out from where they are in Washington, to get out from their own district, and to go and feel and think what other people in other parts of the area are thinking and feeling. Now people are in their insulated holes, insulated narrow areas, and they haven't been able to do that. That's why national service is so important. That's why a broad political career is so important, a winding path will let you see various things. When Teddy Roosevelt was police commissioner, he would wander the streets at night with a disguise on so that he had a big hat over his head and a big raincoat so he could see whether the policemen were doing their job. And then finally he reaches out to one person who's not. He's with a girl on the street and he says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "What's it to you, man?" And of course he didn't recognize that it was the police commissioner. And then after a while there were cartoons of these big teeth and spectacles that frightened every policeman. But that ability to get out of where you are and just see who the people you're working with, see who the people in the country are thinking and feeling, has been lost to us, I think. They spend so much time raising money for their campaigns. That's the poison in the system, and we have to do something about it. How can they be politicians learning about us if they're calling donors all the time? In fact, I would argue that one of the reasons why democracy has faltered in a lot of these countries is that in so many of these countries, the economic system is tilted so that the people on the top are making an enormous amount of money, and the people on the bottom are not sharing in the wealth of their country. And then they get resentments. They get resentments toward immigrants. They get resentments toward other people and other races, thinking that's the problem. I mean, that was what happened in the industrial era. The industrial era, like this, was an era where there was a lot of gap between the rich and the poor, just like the tech revolution and globalization have created today. There were immigrants, there was anxiety, there was populism, but yet we had a leader in Teddy at Roosevelt that was able to channel that into reform. And I think we've got to realize that that is at the core, I think, of what's happening in a lot of these countries right now. So it's social justice, it's economic opportunity, it's mobility, it's education, it's what's going to allow people who have a sense of talent and discipline and want to move as far up in that system as they can. That was the promise of democracy, and that promise is not being kept right now, and we've got to make sure that it's kept.
David, in your really excellent book, Eyewitness to Power, you make the observation that ever since Kennedy's time, the White House has gradually abandoned the bully pulpit to television and cable news networks, in which executive producers became the arbiters of what Americans hear and see of their president. Has Twitter and Donald Trump's use of Twitter reversed that trend?
Yeah, I'm so sick of talking about Twitter. I do think it's not a sign of progress that for some 500 years, when people went to bed at night, they usually had on their nightstand by their bed a copy of the Bible. And today we have iPhones instead of the Bible. And you know, we're losing our way here. I thought originally that, and I continue to believe that there's great promise about the way we communicate with each other in the internet age, digital age. But somehow like all new technologies, there's a dark side as well as a bright side, and we are increasingly playing on the dark side. Twitter, in my experience at least, brings out the worst in us frequently, because to be heard, if you say something bland on Twitter, nobody reads it, nobody retweets it. If you say something that's sharp, has a jagged edge, then you get a lot of likes, and you get a lot of retweets, but you also get a lot of garbage, and you get threats. But the whole point is, if you want to be noticed, the way you get noticed is to say something outrageous. And we're in this sort of descending spiral. It's hard to get much more graphic or pornographic than some of the stuff that's out there now. But I do think I think we miss leaders who can speak to us as adults and speak to us with an eloquence that's drawn from studying history, that's drawn from studying great speakers of the past, reading the great literatures. We need some leaders now who are not only know how to work the digital and work the internet, but we need poets. We need people who come out of the humanities. It's something we need, and in terms of our universities, the number of people who are now majoring in the liberal arts has dramatically declined in colleges and universities. It's really quite small, because we tell our children, well, you gotta get a job, you better study a computer, you better study computer science, and people spend a lot of time doing that, and I have nothing against that per se, but if it's the expense of studying the humanities and understanding what makes us a people and what makes a civilization, then we've lost something very precious. And we need to have conversations that allow us to draw upon that. One of the reasons I'm drawn to Doris's work is that I find it ennobling. And that's what I found in Warren's work. It sort of lifts my spirits. It gives me a loftier vision of who we are and what we can become. To go back and read the stories of Lincoln in particular, Doris is particularly wonderful on Lincoln. It's just, if you read those stories often enough, you can emerge with a sense of, we're going to make it through this, and we're going to make it through this because we're going to draw together, and someone is going to speak to the better angels of our nature.
And we have to believe that. I mean, I think I don't mean to be projecting, as I think we have a sad tone. I mean, my study of history tells me that we've been through worse times before. I mean, I think about Lincoln and the anxiety he faced when the Civil War was about to kill 600,000 people. He said he wasn't sure he could live through it if he had known what it would be. Think of what it would be like if we were living now through the Great Depression or through World War II before the ending of that war was clear. And yet somehow the spirit of America and the spirit of these leaders were able to carry us through, so long as the citizens were awakened. I mean, Lincoln was called the liberator. He said, don't call me that. It was the anti-slavery movement that did it all. It was the progressive movement that underlay Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, the civil rights movement for Lyndon Johnson, the women's movement. It's always the citizens. So it's that combination, I think, of activism, which is in our nature as a people. So I remain still thoughtful that things may be difficult right now, as long as we recognize this is not the norm, this is not the way it should be, to have a new breaking news every day, to not be paying attention to the long run, to be just caught up in the short run. We just have to think our way out of this. We have to, FDR said, man creates problems, man can solve problems. And we have to believe that the norm that we're seeing is not the norm that has to continue. We can reform this political system of our own, and we can make it better, and I truly believe that.
I agree with that, but don't you think that every generation has to earn democracy? You can't, we can't take it for granted anymore.
Absolutely. In fact, that's what FDR, this generation has a rendezvous with destiny, he told the 1930s and 40s generation. And this generation has a rendezvous with democracy. I think you're right. Go ahead. Are you next?
So we unfortunately are running out of time. I do want to allow our audience members to ask some questions. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Speaking to the students, Doris and David, what advice might you have for them? Our theme today is building a culture of fresh ideas. What can you say to maybe encourage them or motivate them to put forward their fresh ideas?
Well, I think one of the most important things in our culture today is that people, leaders, and maybe young people too, are not taking time out to think. As David said, the iPhone is right there. Your computers come with you. You're not able to find time away from your work to just relax and replenish your spirits. And I think that's what's so missing in our world. We feel so frenzied in this world right now, and yet I think our frenzy of thinking we have 24/7 complications in our world is nothing compared to these characters who went through the Depression and World War II, and yet they all found time to think. They found time to relax. I mean, Lincoln actually went to the theater. Speaking of Shakespeare, for Warren Bennis, he felt that when he was at the theater, somehow he could imagine himself in another world other than the Civil War, and he could go back to the War of the Roses and begin to think about human nature in the way that Shakespeare thought about human nature, and he could somehow get out of that channel of thought. Teddy Roosevelt still took time to exercise 2 hours every afternoon so that he could get his mind in a different place when he needed to, so he could come back to the pressures of the day. He wasn't bringing his cell phone with him when he took these walks in the wooded cliffs of Rock Creek Park. Franklin Roosevelt had a cocktail party every night in the Oval Office, and the rule was, when World War II was happening, that you were not allowed to talk about the war. You could gossip, you could talk about movies you'd read, you could movies you'd seen, you could talk about books you'd read, as long as the war didn't get mentioned. And after a while, this cocktail hour was so important to him that he wanted the people who would be going to the cocktail party to be living at the White House with him to be ready for the cocktail party. So the White House became the most exclusive residential hotel you could possibly imagine. His foreign policy advisor, Harry Hopkins, came for dinner one night, never left till the war came to an end. His secretary, Missy LeHand, lived with the family in the White House. Eleanor's great friend lived next to her, Lorena Hickok, and then the great Winston Churchill came and spent weeks at a time in a room diagonally across from Roosevelt's, and he and Roosevelt would stay up at night drinking until 2 a.m., getting away from the pressures of the day. In fact, my favorite story to tell about World War II happens to be that when I was working on the book on Franklin and Eleanor, I became obsessed with the idea that they were all in their bathrobes in the corridor that surrounds the bedroom suites, and was so mad at myself that when I was up there with Lyndon Johnson at 24, I'd forgotten to ask. I didn't even think of asking, where did Harry Hopkins sleep? Where was Winston Churchill? Where were the Roosevelts? And I happened to mention this on a radio program in Washington, which Hillary Clinton, then in the White House, was listening, so she promptly called me up at the radio station, invited me to have a sleepover with them in the White House, so that we could then wander the corridor and figure out where everyone had slept 50 years earlier. So a couple weeks later, she followed up with an invitation to a state dinner, after which between midnight and 2 a.m., the President, Mrs. Clinton, my husband, and I, with my map in hand, went through every room up there and figured out, yes, Chelsea Clinton is sleeping where Harry Hopkins was, Bill Clinton and Hillary are sleeping where FDR was, and we were given Winston Churchill's bedroom. There was no way I could sleep. I was certain he was sitting in the corner drinking his brandy and smoking his ever-present cigar. But I think the importance of that is there are layers of history that are always behind us when we walk around the streets, when we go into these places where something took place, and we remember that somehow these people found time to think. Teddy Roosevelt said, books are the greatest human nature, books of poetry and prose, and that's your point about humanities. And we get so caught up, I think, in our daily life, and I just would hope that young people, as they consider public service, my husband, who died this last May, his life was given to public service, and it was such an exploratory, adventurous life. And maybe he could have gone into private life earlier on. He was first in his class at Harvard Law School, clerk for Justice Frankfurter, but he wouldn't have traded it for anything in the world, to have worked for Kennedy, to have done Johnson's civil rights speeches, to have been with Bobby Kennedy when he died, and to have felt in those last years and last months of his life, he was writing a book about the American ideals, and that he loved America. Not the America of our physical structure, but the ideals for which it stood. And he was the one who had the optimism about the future. He said, I've lived a long life. I lived through the Depression. I lived through World War II. He had been in the White House. He had seen John Kennedy killed. He had been with Bobby Kennedy when he had died. And there was a sense, however, he said, America's not as fragile as we think. We've gone through these ups and downs before, and we will come out of that. It was the book he not finished before he died, a book that I'm hoping to finish before I die, but it's that optimism, that belief in the ideals of this country that keeps me going and keeps me much more optimistic than part of my statements might suggest. Maybe that optimism comes from having been a Brooklyn Dodger fan and a Red Sox fan, but finally, we were able to win. And America, I mean, my husband would say, no one would exchange being in America for any other country in the world, and we have to remember that.
Wow. That was so eloquent. I have more things to say, but I'll just say one quick thing, and that is the importance of service for the next generation. And coming off the sidelines, getting in the arena early and giving back to the country is really important. And I would tell the younger generation, there was a time 10 years ago, 20 years ago, if you wanted to serve, I would say go to Washington and have an opportunity to do that. I tell young students today, if you want to make a difference, work in a city, go work for your mayor. You have a wonderful mayor here in Cincinnati. Go work in his office, and you'll get something done, and it will inspire you. Change is going to come from the ground up. So change is going to come from the heartland of the country, and that's where young people can really make a difference.
Thank you. So we do have a plane to catch. David has a plane to catch. So we will take questions until David has to leave to get on that flight.
Doris, you can add, as long as Doris is willing to talk. She's a wonderful storyteller.
So do we have questions? Do we have a mic?
I'll project. Chris Carter from our Department of Political Science. I first want to thank both David and Doris, because they took a little extra time before this event and met with about 20, 25 students from the university and in their leadership roles, and we had a terrific session with them. So thank you for taking that extra time with them. I wanted to draw you a little bit on two themes that you threw out to them: the importance of character to leadership, and the notion that one of the pieces of that character is the notion of humility. And I guess, my main question is, how can we be humble in this digital age that, as you were mentioning earlier, David, promotes the bold, the brazen, the obnoxious at certain times, right? So if character and humility is an important leadership trait, what are your thoughts about how we manage that in this technological environment that we're in?
Go ahead.
You know, at West Point, they've given a lot of consideration to this question of how they should prepare people to be young officers in the Army. And they've come up with a little slogan about be, know, do. Those are the three pillars of their educational system. And the B is about character, the know is about understanding how to do your job, and the do is also about that. So the know part of it, they've gotten down. They can do that in the classroom. The do part of it, they can get that. In the summer, they send people out in the field, and you have these variety of exercises, and you learn how to lead troops. The B part of it, the character part, is the most elusive and the most difficult to know how to prepare, how to forge people's characters. And some would argue by the time you get to 18, 19, 20, it may be too late already to try to correct people. And I'm not sure there's an answer. Universities are struggling with this question now about encouraging strong character. What we do know is that moral courage is an incredibly important part of leadership. This theme runs all through Doris's latest book. All four of the figures that she described displayed moral courage along the way. All of them had their character shaped in part by adversity. Coming through those crucible moments. They were heavily influenced by their parents and the parenting that went on, that coming from the backgrounds that they did. They all had, I can't speak to this exactly, Doris, but I think all of them had strong mothers. And it made a big difference in shaping their character. So we don't know, there's no set formula. But I can just tell you that every organization I've ever been acquainted with, whether I worked there or just read about it, that the character of the CEO, the character of the leader, is fundamental to the quality of the organization. Everybody takes their cues off the leader. It's no longer, we're no longer in a situation where you're up on top, as a leader, you're up on top of Mount Olympus, hurling thunderbolts, telling people to do this or do that. The leader is much more at the center of a circle. And you radiate out from there the kind of behaviors that you wish to see in the organization and the aspirations of the organization, having a narrative about the journey you're on as a group. And the character of the person in the center is what becomes the character of the organization itself. You show me a person who's cutting corners at every stage, who's basically lying your way through, faking their way through it, blustering their way through it, and I'll show you somebody who is going to last for a while, but eventually is going to go down, and if you're not careful, will take down the organization as well.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think when we decide who we're electing as our leaders, understanding what character means is much more important than who zings who in a debate, who's raised the most money, who's said the most outlandish thing. Before Tim Russert died, he and I talked about the fact that what we should be doing when we think about our leaders, they've all come from somewhere. Usually they've been a leader somewhere else, and you can measure whether they have humility, empathy, resilience, courage, whether they can control their emotions, whether they can build a team that can work together with strong-minded people. All these things we know make good leaders, and in the end, it is temperament, it is character. I mean, just one story that illustrates that so well. When I came to the end of the Team of Rivals book, I just couldn't bear ending it with Lincoln's death. I can't stand it when my guys die after I've lived with them for so long, and especially Abraham Lincoln. And was lucky enough to find this wonderful interview that Leo Tolstoy gave to a New York reporter at the turn of the 20th century, and it had to do with Lincoln, and it had to do with his character. And Tolstoy said he had just come back from a remote area of the Caucasus, where there were a group of wild barbarians who'd never left that part of Russia, and they were so excited to have Tolstoy in their midst that they asked him to tell stories of the great men of history. So he said, I told them about Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Frederick the Great and Julius Caesar, and they seemed to love it. But before I finished, the chief of the barbarians stood up and said, but wait, you haven't told us about the greatest ruler of them all, that man who spoke with the voice of thunder, who laughed like the sunrise, who came from that place called America that is so far from here that if a young man should travel there, he'd be an old man when he arrived. Tell us of that man. Tell us of Abraham Lincoln. Tolstoy was stunned to know that Lincoln's name had reached this remote corner, but he told them everything he could about Lincoln. And then the reporter said, so what made Lincoln so great after all? And Tolstoy conceded, well, he may not have been as great a general as Napoleon. He may not have been as great a statesman as Frederick the Great, but his greatness consisted in the integrity of his character, the ultimate standard for judging our leaders. That very thing that Lincoln would have dreamed all his life from the time he was 23, that he would be judged by future generations, that his story would be told to others. Somehow that was in him from the time he was young, to do something that would make a difference, and he was recognized, and he still is recognized, and it is character above all that made the difference.
Whoa. I didn't find that in the book.
What?
I've got to find that in the book.
Oh, yeah.
It must be in the 50 pages I haven't read yet.
No, not the new.
Yeah.
Oh, it's
the
there.
the
You'll find
Tolstoy.
Tolstoy. Tolstoy's my favorite. He's the greatest storyteller of all time.
That's wonderful.
Go ahead. No, sorry. With the exception of our president, who I think is an exception in a lot of ways, it seems like to get into higher office, one has to go to Harvard Law School, Yale Law School. How does someone from the humanities, the University of Cincinnati's history program, break into higher office?
I don't agree with the general proposition that in order to get to high office, you have to have gone to an elite school. I think there are numerous exceptions to that, and I hope that over time we have more exceptions to that. That's not to say that going to one of these elite schools, I happen to teach at one of the elite schools. I think we ought to, there's a danger in this country that we're going to start treating our colleges and universities. There's an assault on the colleges and universities underway right now, let's put it that way. And there's a survey out, are colleges and universities good for the country? A majority of 65-70% say yes. Among Republicans, 45% say colleges and universities are bad for the country. That is an alarming number. It's an alarming number. From my point of view, our colleges and universities are among our crown jewels. And it's what distinguishes our K-12 system is badly flawed. We all know that. But we tend to make up for it in our colleges and universities. And we are going to be just in terrible trouble if the government really does unleash various attacks on higher education. It is not a good thing. It is not a good thing.
Yeah, Lyndon Johnson's father always told him that if you brush up against the grindstone of life, you'll have more polish than anybody who ever went to those elite schools. And I think that's right. I mean, maybe sometimes people don't feel it. Even Lyndon Johnson himself always worried that he wouldn't be given a fair chance because he hadn't gone to Harvard and Yale. But it wasn't true. I mean, that was not what undid him. It's that lack of confidence. And I went to Colby College in Maine. It was a wonderful liberal arts school. It doesn't have the reputation that a Harvard had. I didn't suddenly become smarter when I went to Harvard University. The idea that these universities get such a sense of entitlement because of you being there, because they are it's ridiculous. There are so many schools in this country. They're just as good as any of these other schools. It depends on how much you work, how the teachers care about you, and in a lot of these other schools, the teachers spend more time with their students than they do at these research universities that like a Harvard or a Yale. It's not saying one or bet the other. It's just being proud of where you are, coming from your city. Just as you're saying that people can go work for the mayor, you go to your own city school and you will have the layers of history from your own city in it. I mean, I agree with what you're saying. You have to have faith that we're not that elitist of a country, and I don't think we are.
Yeah, I should add to that. I do think colleges and universities, in many cases, are acting too elitist.
Right.
And we need to deal with that. And we need to make sure that there are opportunities for families who are making $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, so that they have an opportunity. We need to, the college and universities should be about opportunity, as well as excellence, as well as truth. And that's a very, very, and too often we have lost our way. One of the good things, I'll just be very provincial about this, but we have a new president at Harvard who is already gone out and gone back to Pontiac, Michigan, where he's just been sworn in. He grew up in Pontiac. He's formed a relationship between Harvard and the University of Michigan so that we can start working with the public universities more and get off our high horse that we can only deal with the MITs and the Stanfords and everything like that. It is incumbent upon those of us who are in these universities to make sure they don't become too elitist, and we're sometimes in danger. I do agree with that. We're sometimes in danger of acting like it.
So I want to continue the questions, but I also want to make sure that David gets his plane. So now I'm going to ask if you would thank David for being with us. David, thank you. We're going to send with David a Cincinnati Bearcat hat and some. We heard you like to golf, so we're sending you home with some golf balls with the UC logo.
Good, 'cause I lose them regularly.
Well, there you go. And we thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you very, very much. Okay. Are you staying?
I guess I'm staying, however, would answer some more questions and would be more than glad to.
It was an honor hearing both of you speak today. And I'm sure Dr. Greger could contribute to this question that I'm about to ask you. Since leadership is something that's been talked about in the past 2,500 years in these prominent documents, that are interpreted, that have gone from, Aristotle to Las Casas and Hugo Grotius, all the way to Thomas Jefferson, and, what now comes to be as like the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Where did Warren Bennis, where would you say he fell into this tradition of what is considered natural law and natural rights?
Well, I think, I'm not sure that I'm answering your direct question, but I thought what you were going to ask, which I will answer, is where did he fall in terms of the notion of whether or not leadership is inborn or whether it can be developed. And I think that, in fact, I talked to him about this one time in one of the 5 or 6 times I was able to be in his presence. And we talked about the fact that there are probably some leadership traits that are inborn. Lincoln, I think, was born with a sense of empathy. He was born with a gift for language, obviously. Teddy Roosevelt had a photographic memory and an extraordinary curiosity. FDR was gifted with that optimistic temperament. And LBJ just had an unbounded energy that no one could probably keep up with. He walked so fast that it was like a blur when he walked. But on the other hand, most leadership traits are developed. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt wrote an essay saying that there were 2 kinds of success in the world. One is if somebody has a special gift, perhaps for poetry or drama, like a Shakespeare or a poet, that no one else, no matter how hard they try, will be able to emulate. But he said most leaders, most people attain success by developing the qualities they have to an extraordinary degree through the application of hard, sustained work. And I guess one thing I would say as an older person to the younger persons here, that in the end is that work ethic that is the most important thing for success in any field. I mean, Lincoln said at one point, somebody said to him, how do you become a good lawyer? And he said, work, work, work. I mean, when he was on the circuit in Illinois and he was wanting to educate himself more fully, in part because, and I'll just quickly tell this story because it has to do with Ohio, when he was a young lawyer, not known outside of Illinois, Edwin Stanton of Ohio was one of the most famous lawyers in the country, and they were on a case together, and Stanton took one look at Lincoln, was humiliated by the way Lincoln looked, because he had a big stain on his shirt, his hair was disheveled, and his trousers too short for his long legs, and he turned to his partner, he said, I don't want this guy working with us. They were going to try the case in Illinois, and then it got passed to Ohio at the end, so they didn't need Lincoln anymore. He said he looks like a long-armed ape. But Lincoln, instead of leaving Ohio and getting upset, which he was, he said he'd never been so humiliated, he stayed and watched Stanton give the trial that entire week. And he said he'd never seen such a brilliant lawyer, and he learned from him. So he went back on the circuit in Illinois. He started studying Euclid at night. He started reading philosophy. He said, I have to educate myself even more fully. And then extraordinarily, when he gets into the presidency and his first Secretary of War has failed, somebody comes to him and said, the only man ready for this job is Edwin Stanton, this man who had humiliated him years before when they were young lawyers. And instead of turning him away because he had once been hurt, as people have now been turning, David was saying before that in the Clinton administration, they didn't want anybody who had been anti-Clinton. In the Trump administration, he doesn't seem to want anybody who had been never Trump. What he was able to do was say, if he's the right man for the job, I want him by my side. And Stanton became his most loyal friend and loved him more than anyone outside of his family. So that combination of working hard, of knowing that other people may know more than you do, of absorbing that knowledge and never thinking you're finished with your work, I think is an important thing for all of us to know in life, and that's what success is about.
Another question? Over here?
I have two quick questions for Doris. First of all, had the Red Sox been playing this afternoon, would you be here? And secondly, using your four guys as an example, how did they utilize or think about power when you talk about leadership? I think that's the thing that I've seen over the years, is that people confuse leadership with power. And the reason that they want the leadership is to get the power rather than to move things ahead some way.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that sometimes the positions of power that people are in, we call them leaders. And it's a question. I mean, it's one of those questions that academics can debate. Does a person who simply holds power but doesn't use it for a benefit of the people, is he a leader or is he simply a power holder? I mean, the interesting thing about Lyndon Johnson when he was young, I think he was accumulating power for its own sake. I mean, even when he was 4 or 5 years old, he wanted to become something that had a sense of power. When he went to college, he decided, how do you get power? Well, you find the people who have power and you learn from them. You make them your mentors and you absorb their power. So he got a job mopping floors outside the president's office of the college so that he could get to know the president. And then after a while, he's mopping the floors so assiduously, working so hard that the president notices him of the college, invites him into the office, and before you know it, he's a clerk. Before you know it, he's the assistant. Before you know it, he's running the president's office. And then when he goes to Washington, he decides as a chief of staff to a young congressman that he wants to learn from the congressional secretaries who are living in the same hotel. They have power more than he do. They've been there longer. He has to learn from them. So he goes into the bathroom in the morning and he brushes his teeth 4 different times so that he can talk to 4 different groups of people coming in. Then at night he takes 4 different showers so he can talk to 4 different people. He finds out who has the most power, who understands the system better than I do. And before you knew it, he was the most sophisticated young congressional secretary in the whole lot. But then, as I said before, after a while, he had experiences that made him want to turn that power into something different, into leadership. When he was in college, he took a year off because he couldn't afford to stay in college, and he taught at this small Mexican-American school in Cotulla, in Texas, and he saw the pain of prejudice on the face of these poor kids who were being prejudiced against because they were Mexican Americans. And he decided, I have to do something. So he became the principal of the school. He gave his salary to build sporting equipment for the kids. He became the band leader, the debate coach. He was like doing everything at the school, and the kids in the oral histories said they never had a teacher who believed in them before. He said, I want to fire ambition in these kids. If they have ambition, they will get somewhere. And then the incredible thing is that made an impact on him. And then he brought rural electricity to the hill country. Then at a certain period of time, when he lost the first Senate race, he decided he had to become more conservative, no longer the progressive New Dealer he had once been. In order to win a Senate race again, he pursued wealth rather than public service. And finally, he does win the Senate seat. He becomes majority leader. And as I said, he finally, when he had that massive heart attack, began to question, is power what I'm looking for, or is it some sense of purpose? And the amazing thing is when he gave the famous We Shall Overcome speech after the Selma demonstrations, and he talked so movingly about the importance of voting rights for Black Americans, in the ending of that speech, he reprised that feeling of being at Cthulhu. And he said, I saw those kids and the pain of prejudice on their face. I never thought then that I would be standing here now and that I would have the power to do something to change the lives of their sons and daughters. But I'll tell you something, I have that power now, and I mean to use it. So that's when power translates itself into leadership, when it's designed so that you can provide economic opportunities, social justice, you can make people's lives better. And that's that transformative moment, and he used it well at that moment. That voting rights bill gets 6 weeks later, becomes law, changes forever the face of the country.
So Doris, we can't let you go without asking you a little bit about your work with Steven Spielberg.
Oh, it was an extraordinary experience. I mean, what happened is he always wanted to make a movie about Lincoln, and he had read Franklin and Eleanor, so he asked me even before I finished the book if I would shake hands with him and have a deal so that he could use my new book when it came out for a movie on Lincoln. So he got 2 script writers even before I finished the book to start working on the project and on a script. But in neither of those scripts did Daniel Day-Lewis say yes. And he knew all along that Daniel was the person he needed as his Lincoln. So finally, Tony Kushner writes the script, and Daniel said yes. He was so excited, Spielberg was. He called me up and he said, you have to take Daniel to Springfield and show him the sights, because he's going to take an entire year. He made him promise, Daniel made Spielberg promise, that he would have a whole year to become Lincoln. He becomes the person he is, and he wanted to do it in private. He didn't want people to know he was Lincoln. So I told all the tour guides, just pretend you don't know who he is. We're going to show you, the State House, show you where he lived with Mary, show you his law offices, and they all agreed everything was fine. We were supposed to eat in the hotel that night under his being an assumed name. So, but we'd become friends on the plane going to Springfield already. So when we got to the hotel, I said, so we're going to eat in the hotel, right? He said, oh no, let's go to a bar. So we went to a bar, and immediately somebody bought us drinks, and I thought, oh my God, it's already over. But they didn't recognize him, they recognized me. So it was a huge joke between us. So anyway, we laughed about that. I went to the filming in Richmond, but he would never let anybody who knew him see him on the set. For an entire year, I'd been sending him books, we'd been texting each other, but he wouldn't let a person see him because he's Lincoln now. He can't talk to you anymore as Daniel Day-Lewis. Even the other actors had to call him Mr. President or Mr. Lincoln. And so I finally don't see my friend Daniel Day until the premieres in LA and New York. So when we got to New York, he said we have to go to a bar to remember that first bar in Springfield. So he took me to his favorite bar, the Carlisle Bar, and he plied me with these old Cuban drinks, which were some concoctions of something, and they were quite delicious, but they were fine. And everything was fine until he wins the first of his series of awards, the New York Circle Critics Award, and Spielberg comes to give him the award, and Spielberg talks about the fact that he had rejected these roles for so long, writing these beautiful letters of rejection saying the scripts were great, but they didn't speak to his heart, until finally he accepted this script, and he was so glad. So Daniel gets up there, and for some unaccountable reason he said, I don't reject everything. When Doris Kearns Goodwin asked me to go binge drinking with her, I accepted at once. So, unfortunately, there was a Wall Street Journal reporter in the room, but I was honored to be in the paper the next day as having gone. But the important point of the story is that when I saw the first cut of the movie at Spielberg's house, with his wife seeing it for the first time and his main assistant seeing it, he was so nervous that he was outside pacing the halls, worried whether we would like it or not. That is the mark of a true professional, to never take anything for granted. And he finally came in and he said, well, what did you think? And we said, we saw Lincoln walking and talking. It was the most extraordinary rendition. This man that I'd lived with for 10 years came to life on that screen. I really felt he had come back into us. So he immediately called Daniel in Ireland. It was like 3 in the morning and said, they liked it. And then we broke out the champagne and celebrated. But when you're a writer, you're writing alone. Luckily, my husband was a writer too, so we could get together every day at noon and go over our work. We went out to dinner at bars every night when I think about it, because in Concord, where we live, all of our friends could get together who would have children who had grown, and we would eat and then talk to each other, and we were a social band of about 10 or 11 or 12 people. But anyway, we would get together, and then there was no camaraderie beyond that, as there is in the making of a movie. So I learned that special project of working with a group of people. Many of you who work in organizations have that specialness too. So it broadened my understanding of because I'm such a social person, I wasn't meant to be a writer, but luckily I've loved this writing profession, and as I say, I wouldn't change anything in the world for having spent all this time with these dead presidents, hoping that I can bring them alive for you, and that you can catapult yourself back into another time and see the layers of history. I think, just if I may say this at the end, I think that storytelling is so important because all of us have stories that we want to tell of our own lives, not just of these presidents' lives. There's a sense in which if you tell the stories of your parents, of what they meant to you, and your grandparents, they too can live on, just as these presidents can live on. And if I've ever meant anything, I think that history's meant to me, it's because in my telling the stories of my own parents, which I told in Wait Till Next Year, who died when I was young, my mother when I was 15, my father when I was in 20s, if I could bring them back to life for myself for just a short period of time, if I can bring these presidents back to life, all of us want to tell the stories of people who've meant something to us, who perhaps are no longer alive. And that's the power of storytelling. It's the power of our country, to tell the story of our country. Abraham Lincoln was worried in the 1830s that there was mob violence in the air. Then when we speak about mobs right now, this was a true mob violence. Anti-slavery editors were being killed. There was lynchings in the South. And he worried that the memories of the revolution were fading and that people were no longer going to remember the ideals of the country and that the rule of law was being broken. So he said that every mother had to read the ideals of the revolution to their children as you would read the Bible. So telling that story of America, I think right now, telling the story of our parents, of our grandparents, of the people who meant something to us who are no longer alive, keeps the past alive, and that's the most important thing we can do. We can then become a broader person, not just a single life going through, but somebody who's absorbing the layers of the past. And if there's any answer to our problems right now, it's to absorb those layers in the past, to remind us where history brought us, remind us where our families brought us, and tell stories. Stories are the way that we link to the past and we link to one another, and that's why I think I believe in storytelling so very much. Thank you.
So, Jack, I think you've got some closing comments.
Talk amongst yourselves.
One question. Doris, how late did you stay up last night?
The night that was the most incredible was the night of the Benintendi catch. I mean, it's been so hard to be on the road while these things, we have season tickets. You know, we've had them now for 35, 40 years, so, but I've been gone, but at least now they'll be in the World Series and hopefully I'll be home. You know, I think as some of you know, I mean, my love of history really began when my father taught me that mysterious art of keeping score when I was a little girl, so I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. And somehow when your father pays attention to you, when you're giving him a history of something that's only 5 hours old, you think there's something special about all this. He never told me then that all of this was actually described in great detail in the sports pages of the newspapers the next day. So I thought without me, he wouldn't even know what happened to the Brooklyn Dodgers. So that love of baseball was transmitted from my father to my kids. And there are times when I can sit with my kids who become equally irrational Red Sox fans now because the Dodgers abandoned us and went to Los Angeles. And when I sit with my kids sometimes, I can imagine myself a young girl once more in the presence of my father, watching the players of my youth on the grass. Those great guys, Jackie Robinson, Pee Wee Reese, Duke Snider, Gil Hodges. And I've got to say there's magic in these moments. And this goes to what I was just saying about storytelling, because sometimes then I can imagine myself back in the past, but then I'm sitting there with my kids, and my kids who never had a chance to meet my father because he died before they were born, but yet they've come to know him through all the stories I have told. So once again, it all comes back to how we relate to one another, how we relate to our past, and baseball seems to be a big part of it for me. And so it's a very exciting time. And I am glad to be with you, however. Commitments are going to be kept no matter what happens, so I'm glad for that.
What do you think? So, Kate had mentioned play as being an important part of Warren's life and had also mentioned Shakespeare, and I know of Warren's love for theater. And so I'm laughing because I had these notes all written out as to what I was going to say, and I am about to completely improvise. So in the spirit of play, I was asked a question as I was coming up here, and the question was, how did this start? How were you as a 21-year-old student inspired to start something like this? And one of my favorite quotes from Warren is, "More leaders have been made on accident than by any other leadership development program out there." And I think it speaks to a lot of what I know Doris has championed in her work, and that is the fact that leaders are made. And so the way that I was made and the way that this came to be was actually through a punishment. So I was a junior in high school, and I came home late from a party, and it really wasn't that late. It was maybe 12:30, and my dad was up waiting for me, and he had a book in his hand, and he had the book on becoming a leader, to which Warren dedicated actually to David. So how special that David was here with us tonight. But the deal was that I had to read the book and highlight the key points from every chapter before I could go out with my friends. So that was my introduction to Warren, and it was my junior year at the University of Cincinnati where I was asked to put together a leadership program for incoming freshmen. And I thought to myself, how am I going to do that? And it took me back to that punishment, my junior year of high school. And I pulled the book out off the bookshelf, and we took each chapter from On Becoming a Leader, and we made that our weekly discussion and material with the students. So I was connected to some UC alum because of that work. I was so inspired with the work that we were doing with the freshman program that I wanted to continue to celebrate and to tell the Bennis story at the University of Cincinnati. So what you're seeing today, and you being in your chairs today, is the direct result of a punishment. So the moral of the story is, make your kids read a book if they get in trouble. So I've actually been given word that there is someone, a special guest, that would like to join in this evening's celebration, and he has a few words for us. So please sit back and enjoy.
During the Depression years, growing up in a family that was struggling gave me a proper sense of identifying, understanding what I would have to do to make it in this world. And that's the work ethic, it's integrity, collaboration, those things, right, I just mentioned. I realized that if I were to succeed, those are the things that are important. That work ethic, integrity, and collaboration. I guess I also grew up, Tom, at a point in our history with the shadow of Hitler and how destructive these dictators were. I realized that leadership can stain a nation's history, stain a corporation's reputation. What more important thing can I be looking at? I wasn't particularly gifted or as a scientist or an engineer. I couldn't do that kind of thing, I knew that. But what could be more important if you're interested in organizations than the leadership of these institutions? I would not be the scholar I am today were it not for my years at Cincinnati. They were the most important learning years of my life, Tom. Everything that I did as the president, my eyebrows were always raised in trying to understand it. I also learned something about collaboration, modesty, and abdication of one's ego. How do we develop the idea of the commons, that we're all in this together, and each of us may have to give a little bit for the common good? In the Middle East, they have a phrase about leaders who don't listen. They say they have tired ears. That leads to revolt. people aren't listening. And if you put that in a microcosm of the university during that period, to know that the administration, not just Warren Bennis, were listening. I think leadership brings out character, and I think I learned who I was, what my voice was. I think it's influenced almost every aspect of my life, from how I use my time, effort, creativity, collegiality, judgments I make. Also, it gives me a lens by which I now examine quality of leadership. The quality of a leader usually accounts for 20 to 25% of the success of the company, using any metric you want. Once you make a distinction between, as I did, between leaders versus managers, and wrote about, in the book Unbecoming a Leader, wrote about a dozen plus distinctions, ending up with one: managers do things right and leaders do the right thing. Well, think about it. But you know, they're both important. But the leader is the one who inspires, who sets the mission and the vision, has the ideas. But there's a big but there. But they subordinate their ego to the talents of others. Riding the hyphen. That's a phrase I invented for what is important today in today's university. How do we get our students to know a discipline really well and to be also a generalist? You cannot be transformational if you're not hyphenated. I think a big part of leadership, Tom, is the capacity to engage people, the capacity to have this kind of conversation. See, I've always defined boredom, this is really a conceit, which I'm not going to give up. I think boredom is when I can't make the person I'm sitting next to interesting. Isn't that narcissistic? I mean, but that's what I really believe. The main thing about leadership is managing yourself. So the first part of emotional wisdom, who you are, how aware you are, how you affect others. Leadership, if nothing else, is about a relationship. It's what it is. Leadership is very simple, made too complex by people who write about it, including me. It consists of three things: a person who's designated as leader, a goal, and a relationship with somebody. If you look at people who fail at leadership, I would say 9 or 8 out of 10 times, it's not their technical competence. It's their emotional wisdom. When I left in '77, I felt that I'm leaving a place where the judgment about my leadership would have to be made years after. When I said earlier that I'm proud to be part of the narrative of the University of Cincinnati, I'm glad I've been part of that history.
Happy Warren Bennis Day. So in closing, Kate mentioned that I had never met and had the opportunity to meet Warren. And this summer, I actually made a pilgrimage to the University of Southern California. And after a 2-hour ride to Los Angeles, I had boxes of Warren's papers sitting in front of me. I was immediately drawn to the folders labeled Cincinnati. The first speech I read was a commencement speech from the late 1970s. And Warren, reflecting on his presidency, said in the speech, "When I arrived at the University of Cincinnati, it was a place that had not yet learned how to dream." Now, when I walk this university's campus today, I carry the Bennis story with me. I carry Warren's spirit of play, optimism, pragmatic dreaming. The Warren Bennis years at the University of Cincinnati have helped us to dream. And dreaming, fresh ideas, and leadership in so many ways are a part of our 2019 bicentennial at the University of Cincinnati, honoring the past, elevating the present, and bending the future. We need ideas, we need leaders, embrace the crucibles. My mentors have shared with me that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, build a team. Let's go together. So I would just like to thank Doris once again for her time and making time in her schedule to be with us this evening. Would like to extend my gratitude towards David, to our wonderful moderators, our sponsors. This would not be possible without our wonderful sponsors listed in the program. And a big shout out to our student team in the back. This is a student-led initiative advised by alumni, faculty, and business community. This would not have happened without those students in the back of the room, so I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And just final housekeeping, so we actually have some of David's books, Doris's most recent book, Warren Bennis's books, as well as books from our moderators, and books from the University of Cincinnati Press. So they released some books about the 200 years that we are now celebrating as a university. So those are all available to you in the back. And then as you make your way out of the exit, we have Warren Bennis t-shirts for you with the quote, "Leadership is the capacity to turn vision into reality." So what better way to celebrate Warren Bennis Day than to wear his quote on your shirt? So. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, please, we seek to make this a part of the fabric of the Cincinnati community, a part of the University of Cincinnati community. Please help us to tell the Warren Bennis story. This is very important. So please share your pictures on social media and use the hashtag WBLE18 and the hashtag Leaders Are Made. It is my privilege to have hosted you this evening with the second annual Warren Bennis Leadership Experience. And may you continue to dream and share your ideas, because a better world lies in our imagination. Thank you very much.